Hello, Dr. Sarlin, and everyone in the History 318 class. My name is Joel Ojeda, and right now this is the third attempt, or no, third take on my lecture, or third presentation, let's just leave it at that for History 318. And I am here to talk and discuss Spartacus. Yes, Spartacus. Now, let me move on to the next slide here and sort of an introduction, if you would. So, who is this man here, the man you see in this picture? Well, if you don't know, this is the man in question. This is Spartacus, the notorious gladiator slave turned military leader that led a massive slave revolt against Rome, ultimately putting a fear into Rome, you know, making them basically shit their pants, if you would. but yes, so this slave revolt would be later known as the Third Servile War or the Spartacus Slave Revolt. Now, let me transition into part one of this presentation. Part one, the early life of Spartacus and his capture by the Romans. So with Spartacus, and there are a lot of different varying accounts on his early life. You have different writers with Plutarch, Florus, and Appian, all giving accounts on his life with some differentiating characteristics or different variations here and there. But one thing to note, there are next to no records regarding his early years. So from starting as a child to growing up into the man that he was. But one thing we do know for certain is that he was a Thracian born around 111 BCE. So Plutarch describes him as being of Madai stock. Madai, or the Madoi, was a southern part of Gaul. So yeah, and originally Plutarch had said, or it was written, he was of nomadic stock, but that was a mistranslation, and Madai stock is what it is. But one thing for certain is that Appian, Plutarch, and Florus all corroborate him being Thracian. So his identity is Thracian. Okay, moving on. So now we continue with his life with what we do know, what we do know of Spartacus. So he served in the Roman army as part of the auxiliary unit. The auxiliary unit was a part of the Roman army, but wasn't comprised of Roman legionaries from Rome. It was comprised of sort of like soldiers, volunteers, conscripts from different allies, provinces, areas, that sort of thing. So later on, he deserted the army and conducted bandit raids against Rome and Roman settlements, and subsequently pissing off the Romans and everyone else that he took stuff from as a bandit. But much like with his birth and his whole identity with the different accounts with Plutarch, Appian, Florus, and all that, there's different accounts if he was even like part of the auxiliary unit, if like he was a bandit from the start, or if he was a prisoner of war, who was fighting against Rome. Actually, Florus actually said that he was a Thracian fighting against Rome. But whatever the reason, he was subsequently captured later by the Romans, and he was sold into slavery. Well, what kind of slavery was he sold into? Was he a farm slave, a mining slave, house slave? What was he? To answer that, he was a gladiator slave. And moving on, to gladiator school he went. So these gladiator schools were known as a ludus in Rome. And so Spartacus was bought by a man named Lentulus Batiatus. His military experience and great physical physique made him a prime candidate as a gladiator, because Spartacus is a big, buff dude, and so Batiatus was always looking for more Gauls, Thracians to kill each other for the enjoyment of the crowds. So Spartacus was a Murmillo in this arena gladiatorial setting. Murmillo was a heavyweight gladiator, and he wore a large bronze helmet accompanied by shin guards known as ochria and shoulder pauldrons. He also had his shield, the scutum, and the short sword gladius. So on the picture here, it's a sort of what he would look like, or sort of like what they would look like right there. But yeah, moving on, continuing to gladiator school, so contrary to what Hollywood and all these other shows portray Spartacus and show him hacking his arena enemies to bits or whatever, kicking them, shooting them in the knee or whatever, that stuff is more or less or pretty much all made up, because in actuality there's little to no records that tell the details of Spartacus' arena fights or what his daily life consisted of outside of the arena during his days of enslavement at the Ludus. But one thing is for certain, the fact that he lived to enact his revolt and escape show that Spartacus had to have been very skilled enough to survive his fights in the arena, or that he was able to put on a good show so that even if he lost, the crowds would not choose to have him executed. Moving on. And now the part one sort of came to a quick close end, mainly due to the fact that it's more or less piecing together his early life when there is a lot of different accounts, little to no information, but just giving what generally historians can give on Spartacus' early life. But now we move on to a major part of this, or one of the major parts in this presentation, and that's the system of slavery in Rome. More specifically, the system of slavery in Rome and sort of how that served as a catalyst for Spartacus. The one thing that pushed him to enact his revolt, to break free. And we're getting into that right now. So the status of slaves and its accepted reality. So for Rome's rulers, they saw the complete domination of another person not as an injustice. They saw it as the natural way of things. The strong should essentially, command the weak, have dominion over the weak. And for many, that was just the accepted norm. But let's make one thing clear: slavery sucks. It sucks in general. But as opposed to Western slavery, before the Civil War, this system of slavery was different in a lot of different ways. But also, slaves were a necessity. They were the lowest class in society. Free criminals had more rights than them. Imagine that. Some guy who probably did God knows what has more rights than you, or let's say a prostitute who, does what a prostitute does. She has more rights than you. So that's right there a kick in the face. And not only that, every facet of their life, of your life if you were a slave, was dictated by their masters or your master. So that's another thing. Continuing on, so large droves of slaves were brought in from many of Rome's wars, because Rome being Rome was always at war in one way or another. The number of slaves a person owned showed their status in society. This particularly was very accepted and looked at greatly with the nobles and aristocrats and all that. Many of them would, march with like an entourage of 15 or more slaves. But yeah, moving on. The role of slaves in Rome. So they were treated like property, as a product to be sold and put to work. So right there, you can already get pictures like you're not being treated like a human. You're a product. So slaves occupied and performed labor in a multitude of different sections of industry, like textiles, farming, mining, etc. Basically anything that required manual labor. Greek slaves were highly valued as they served as personal tutors for children of nobles, and also because of the fact that Rome just has this hard on for all things Greek or what have you and stuff like that. And one actual similarity between Western slavery before Civil War in America and Roman slavery is the slave markets. They operate almost everywhere with the buying and selling of slaves. Public slave auctions were everywhere. Moving on. Now we have treatment of slaves in Rome. So treatment varied from master to master. You would have good masters, then you have the masters that you probably want to stab them in their sleep or something, or kick them in the balls. But that's just that. But it varied. So a slave could purchase their freedom or the freedom of their families, because masters of slaves could pay them a wage if they deigned it or whatever, and they would save that and buy the freedom of their children or themselves, whatever. And in times when Rome wasn't at war, which was something, you know, the government seen sort of, they made laws, enacted some laws to limit harsh punishments on slaves, only to ensure that they didn't become damaged goods. Because, like I previously mentioned, they were viewed as property. And if something happens to your property, let's say your car gets banged up or it's getting up there in years, it depreciates in value. The same thing here with human lives, apparently. And that was a given. Especially when Rome wasn't in war, meaning there weren't any fresh slaves coming in, so they're pretty valuable at that time, in those times. And the gladiator slaves were treated like crap. They were forced to take a vow to be beaten, burned, branded, and to die by the sword. So, yeah, that's probably fun for Spartacus, you know? He's having to live out the rest of his days as if it were his last. You know, all for the entertainment of the crowd. So that's enough to piss off anyone, honestly. And this is where the crux, the creme de la crop, sort of all culminates together with Spartacus. And we have part 3, the Spartacus slave revolt. So this fated event occurred in 73 BCE. Spartacus and 78 other slaves enacted their plan to escape the gladiator school. To do this, they raided the kitchen, armed themselves with knives and spits. It was then that they killed their instructors and captors. You know, kind of had it coming to them, but, you know, whatever. It was after that, after killing them, they found one of the storerooms that held weapons that the gladiators used. They also found a supply wagon, and from there they properly armed themselves. So now they're busting out. They're going all, let's say, was it Shawshank Redemption or whatever, except they're not crawling through a sewage pipe full of shit. So, continuing on. They escaped, and Spartacus and his cohorts made their way to Mount Vesuvius, recruiting slaves and freemen on the way. They encamped on the slopes of the mountain, and it was on the mountain that all the slaves under Spartacus made him their leader. Crixus and Oenomus, 2 other slaves close to Spartacus, were made his subordinate officers. So, when news finally reached the Roman Senate, their initial response was weak. There is actually looking back, we would think they were stupid, but there was a lot of other factors at play that, you know, sort of, that influenced this heavily. So, they saw this revolt more of a bother than a threat. Because Rome at the time was in the midst of 2 conflicts. The war with Sertorius, whose name sounds like Artorias from Dark Souls, but I digress. And the conflict against Mithridates in Asia Minor, being part of the Mithridatic War. So at this time, they did not see a need to divert, Roman soldiers against something they saw to be a minor nuisance. They more like, feces on your shoes or something like that. So they sent a detachment of 3,000 militiamen, not legionaries, under the command of Gaius Claudius Labor. And when I say militiamen, I mean it. And I am doing the air quotes right now, even though you cannot see it. But I digress, like I say. So Labor and the Senate believed they could easily quell this uprising because they thought that the slaves did not possess any military or strategic knowledge. They would be wrong. Let us continue. The Battle of Mount Vesuvius. Labor and his forces surrounded the slaves at their camp to starve them out. Unoriginal tactic, but hey, whatever, So Spartacus ordered his men to make ropes out of the vines on the mountain. It was then they rappelled down and surprise attack Labor and his men. So how did this happen to Glaber? How did Spartacus and the manage to take him by surprise? Well, on the mountain, there was a particular part of terrain that Glaber neglected to post any troops because this part of terrain was deemed, inaccessible by any sort of means, in their opinion. And when you look at it that way, it's easy to understand why he did it. But Spartacus, with his wit and his knowledge and his military experience, proved them wrong. So it was then they surprise attacked them, killed a lot of them, and now they looted whatever weapons that these militiamen had and increased their arsenal. So now you have slaves with proper equipment instead of gladiatorial gear. So that's another thing that Rome should be worried about now. So now you have the attempt of Varenus. A second force was sent to take care of the slaves. It was under the command of Publius Varenus. Varenus split his forces, hoping to pincer in Spartacus's troops. Failed miserably, and his horse was taken by Spartacus's trophy, adding further insult to injury, because now Spartacus looks like awesome now because he's riding a horse. Horses were hard to come by. Only the nobles had them. So this definitely served as a morale boost and probably more reason for other people to join his cause. So now we have a second response from Rome, which now they start to take him seriously. Because at this point, they realize the threat that Spartacus and his now 70,000 men represented. Because at this point, they called upon the two consuls, Publicola and Clodianus. Publicola engaged Crixus' forces, and Clodianus engaged Spartacus' forces. Crixus' forces were beating back with heavy losses, but Spartacus managed to beat Clodianus and drive Publicola back from the field. But unfortunately, sad face, teary eye, Crixus dies in battle, so that sucks. Because now this is one of Spartacus' friends or close allies. Now he's dead. So sad face. Moving on. Now we have, here comes Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, part of the first triumvirate, the man with swag, whatever. So Publicola and Clodianus both were retired of power by the Senate. So they just basically told him, y'all messed up, get out here, let Crassus take it over. And they gave supreme command to Marcus Licinius Crassus and also gave whatever forces were remaining to him to add to his already private army. So he wanted to put an end to this war quickly, not only because it would boost his swag, his renown, and try to one-up Pompey, but yeah, that's just how it is. So in doing this, at the borders of Picenum, he sent his legate Munius to circle around the rebels from behind in an attempt to have some men posted for like a rear attack or do some reconnaissance or whatever. He gave explicit orders to Munius not to engage these rebels, not to do it. But Munius disobeyed, and he summarily got his ass handed to him. Go figure. So it was at this point Crassus need to make a point and say that you need to listen to your superior here, because now you have someone who is directly disobeying an order, and there needs to be punishment. So he provided punishment called decimation, which had not been used for over 200 years. What decimation was essentially 10 men formed a decade. They would draw lots, and if they lost, they would be killed. So Crassus killed 50 decades, which is the equivalent of 500 men. It was to show that whatever Spartacus can do, I can do worse, if not more. I can basically make you shit your pants on command if I wanted to. And as cruel as this was, it yielded results, because now his army was more than ever going to listen to what he said. And this amounted to victory, a couple of victories over Spartacus that pushed him back to a place in southern Italy called Lucania. Spartacus made a deal with Cilician pirates to take his army to Sicily, to conquer it and take it for their own, to set it up as a place, a haven for all slaves under him, basically, a nation of their own, whatever. And being pirates, double-crossed him and sailed away without Spartacus and his men after they were paid. Crassus still continued to weaken the insurgent forces, and we reached the sort of like the last battle of Spartacus. This all culminates near or at the Battle of Salarius River. Spartacus' troops made a final last stand, but was ultimately defeated. Plutarch, or normally this is where many of the accounts just end, just say Spartacus died and don't really give details on his death. But Plutarch gives a more glorious end, and he tries to be more sympathetic and sort of show that Spartacus went out fighting like a badass, like Leonidas from 300. So, so at the battle, Spartacus made a rush. Plutarch writes that he made a rush towards Crassus in an attempt to kill him. Even if he dies, he's taking him with him. But on the way charging him, he trips over some men, and is at this point that they're all trying to dogpile on him and try to kill him. He's fighting until he fights to his last breath, till he's ultimately killed. And after that, that's the end of Spartacus. So now Crassus, after this, crucifies almost 6,000 insurgents along the Appian Way. So now you have nothing but crosses of people, of people on crosses as far as the eye can see, like similar to what Vlad the Impaler did when he impaled people and put them out on display for everyone. Hooray! You know, sad times. And that's where it ends with Spartacus. You know, but his life may have ended, but his legacy lived on. And going on to our conclusion, you know, his life for many is one of multiple complexities, both for the many accounts that write of him and even for modern interpreters. Yet, despite these, the legacy left behind by Spartacus and his name became a symbol, a strong thing even in this modern age, even today, a symbol of the courage, the strength to fight against oppression and injustice in the name of freedom. Spartacus became that symbol. While at first he may have wanted to at first he just wanted freedom for himself and his men. He never really tried to, abolish the system of slavery, but the unintended effect was like he became a sort of symbol for anyone fighting for freedom. And this is something we see with him. But, whatever the case may be, that's really with the life of Spartacus, Spartacus, the mighty and awesome gladiator bathing in the blood of his enemies. It's one last joke to end off on, but yeah, thank you so much. And this concludes my presentation. Have a good day, everyone.